könntest überhaupt hier?
Ich verbrech das so, dass ich in dem Wald rein bin. Ich trag dir die Rotznase noch so lang, bis es leer wird. Die saublöde Weib. Für uns geht's kein Tode. Nee.
In the summer of 1976, in a quiet Bavarian town, a 23-year-old woman died. She weighed only 68 pounds. That's almost 31 kilos. She had not been murdered. She had not been in an accident. In fact, she had been prayed over for 10 months, 67 times, by 2 Catholic priests, with the blessings of her bishop and the desperate belief of her family. Her name was Anneliese Michel, and what happened to her sits at a collision point between faith, medicine, culture, and tragedy. A collision that should never have been allowed to happen. Hi, my name is Lona and welcome to this episode of Whispers of Evil. In this episode we discuss a potential demonic possession and a death caused as a result by that or as a result of starvation and negligence. If this subject is a bit too challenging for you to deal with, I totally understand. I suggest you skip this video and maybe return for the next one if that's something that you can handle. And for those of you who are staying, if you could do me a favor and that is like the video, that will be much appreciated. And if you are like me, a big fan of true crime, then be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any uploads. Because I will try and upload a video every week on European true crime cases that have not been covered that much by other true crime channels. Now, let's get into the story of Anneliese Michel. In order to understand Anneliese, you have to understand the world she was brought into. She was born in 1952 in a small rural Bavarian town called Leibelfling. This was at the time the most religious and conservative region of Western Germany. It wasn't progressive like other parts of Germany such as Frankfurt and Berlin. Quite the opposite. Bavaria was deeply Catholic insular and it was rooted in tradition. It mostly stayed untouched from the secularizing wave that had swept the rest of Western Europe after the Second World War. And for most Catholic people, the devil was more of a symbolic figure due to the emergence of the Vatican Council in 1960. However, Anneliese and her family believed in the older, harsher form of Catholicism. They believed he was real. He could enter the human world, and he could control human beings. Additionally, in this kind of community, to be a martyr was theologically meaningful. It was even beautiful. To take on the suffering of others, in the name of your religion, in the name of your God, what higher praise can be bestowed upon you? You are worthy of the suffering that other people probably cannot bear. And because of these deep religious roots, it would be unthinkable to question your priest. You are speaking against the word of God. And if you add in the complexities of the Second World War, the trauma that that era produced, and then as well as the West German legal system that has been deliberately designed to limit state power over individuals, because of what happened in the Second World War. The idea was well-meaning. It was meant to stop totalitarian control, and therefore there were no bad intentions. However, it made it very difficult for authorities to intervene in private religious practices. Anneliese's parents were Joseph and Anna Michel. They were just your average, working class, devout Christians. And by all accounts, they were good parents. They tried their best by their children, they worked with their community, and they did everything according to their faith. But the family did carry a heavy burden. A burden of shame. Because Anna had a child out of wedlock. An illegitimate child from before her marriage. And because of that, Anneliese was brought up with a theology of guilt and atonement. And she spoke about it a lot in her diaries. And she often spoke in her diaries how she wanted to accept the suffering of other people. She believed she could be a vessel to take on this pain that the world is feeling. Which meant that when suffering did come knocking on her door, it would be there for her to endure. And in fact, it would be a very noble pursuit. And interestingly enough, nothing happened in her childhood that could have predicted this catastrophe. It simply was a result of her neurology. Partially the culture she lives in, and the failures of the institutions that surrounded her. Imagine being deep asleep at 16 years old, and suddenly you wake up in the middle of the night. You can't move a finger, let alone sit up. And it feels like somebody is sitting on your chest, crushing you. You have an impending feeling of doom, a sense of dread, a feeling that something evil is watching you. As I describe this, I'm sure most of you understand that this is probably sleep paralysis, which is a scientific phenomenon where the brain wakes up but the body stays asleep. It is a completely neurological phenomenon that many people experience, and it's pretty well documented. Have you ever had sleep paralysis? I don't think I've ever had true sleep paralysis. I've kind of had like a semi sleep paralysis where I've kind of semi woke up and I couldn't really, like, I wasn't fully conscious and awake, but I was like half asleep still and I couldn't move my body. I've never had a true sleep paralysis where my body is wide awake and my mind is wide awake and I can't move my body. But what is described in terms of feeling a sense of dread and fear and feeling that your chest is being crushed, this is a very normal experience. And if you have had sleep paralysis, I would love for you to write down your experiences down below, what it felt like for you. Because in fact, most people that experience sleep paralysis, they all seem to experience this sense of a malevolent presence in the room with them. A feeling like they're being held down, that they're seeing shadows in the corner of the room. And they all say it's very scary and disorientating. And it feels extremely frightening because it does feel very real in that moment. And I can imagine, I can imagine how scary that must be just to wake up and not be able to move your body. And then on top of that, for some reason, it feels like something evil is sitting on top of you or watching you from the corner. Yeah, I'm sure it's absolutely frightening. Now, add on top of this, you are a 16-year-old, extremely devout Catholic girl, like Annaliese was, who believed the devil was real, who believed he could visit her, and that she could even be a vessel for his control. They didn't really have a neurological framework for what happened. They only had a religious explanation. So besides the sleep paralysis, she also had temporal lobe epilepsy. And this is quite a misunderstood condition within medicine because its symptoms, unlike many others, are quite difficult to observe. Unlike many other versions of epilepsy, temporal lobe epilepsy will change your sense of emotion, the language and the way you speak, your sense of self, your perception of smell, taste, and even your memory. So when this region of the brain misfires, you don't show it physically, you experience it psychologically. An example of what patients experience are things like involuntary vocalizations, such as deep growlings, or speaking in altered tones, that they're not really in control of consciously. They have visual hallucinations, and they often see threatening or distorted faces. Additionally, they can have auditory hallucinations, like hearing voices, and they can even smell foul smells like burning or something that smells sulfurous. They experience sudden overwhelms, a sense of dread, a feeling of something evil being in the room. They have intense floods of emotions such as guilt or fear, and often it feels very spiritual without no external causes. And when I describe to you all of these symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy, such as hallucinations, smelling foul smells, the feeling of dread, seeing distorted faces, hearing voices, speaking in altered tones, what does this remind you of? Yeah, that's right, these are the same symptoms that the Catholic Church describes for demonic possession. And add to that temporal lobe epilepsy is actually quite difficult to treat with medication. And it's quite normal to be resistant to the medication, which Annaliese was. And it didn't mean that her diagnosis was wrong. In fact, this is actually very consistent with the diagnosis. However, because she was resistant to the treatment, the medical treatment, this was only more proof to her family that indeed she was possessed. And I can kind of get that, to be fair. That makes sense, right? So you're a religious person, you have sleep paralysis, which you may not even have heard of at that time. And like, even if you did, maybe because even if there was a thing back then that was medically documented, if you're very religious, you are more inclined to think that experiences are perhaps religious as opposed to medically explainable. Then on top of that, you start seeing things, you start hearing things, and you do go to a doctor, but the medication isn't working because the condition is such that it just isn't so easy to treat, and you have to constantly switch around the medications and adjust it until you find the right one. Of what else are you going to think? Like, I think this is a very logical explanation to assume that, well, something else supernatural is obviously happening to her. Between 1969 and 1973, things started to escalate significantly, and the voices started to become very horrible. They told her she was doomed. She started seeing demonic faces in between her seizures, and the smell of evil was constant. And she started to become depressed, which is obviously understandable. But because of this, she did have to drop out of university. She was studying to become a teacher, but because of the symptoms, she was not able to continue her studies, and she ended up withdrawing. And then an even worse fate became her. She was no longer able to rely on her religion due to the epilepsy. She wasn't able to pray. She recoiled at religious images, and she could not swallow holy water, again furthering the idea that potentially she is possessed. The one thing that had been a constant in her life, her faith, it had been taken away from her. The God she loved and trusted was no longer there for her. But from a neurological perspective, this was pretty explainable, because temporal lobe seizures are often accompanied with psychosis. And usually what it does, it actually targets the patient's most emotionally significant belief system, which in this case for Anneliese was her religion. Anneliese did not have a neurological framework, she only had a theological one. And for her to not be able to participate in her religious practices left her feeling spiritually abandoned. She did eventually confide in a priest, but the priest did not suggest for her to continue working with her doctors. Instead, he suggested she might be experiencing something that may not be able to be fixed with modern medicine. A seed was planted, and now they just had to but wait and see it grow. The possession framework was created. Her experiences are no longer neurological events, but they are demonic manifestations. This means that medicine could no longer cure Anneliese, and she was about to begin the biggest battle of her life. The battle between good and evil. The battle over her body between the sacred and the demonic. And because of her religion and her upbringing, The suffering that she was about to endure was noble. It was holy. Because she wasn't sick. She was a chosen one. She was chosen to become a martyr. Anneliese was also an avid journaler, which is again a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy. She would write about how she knows she can endure the suffering, and how if she could take on this suffering, she would maybe make the world a better place. And the feedback loop was very simple. It worked like this. The worse she got, the more the possession narrative was confirmed. The more confirmed it felt, the more she resisted medicine. The more she resisted medicine, the worse her symptoms became. And her symptoms would become more and more dramatic. Her symptoms therefore reinforced again the supernatural interpretation. During the exorcisms, 6 demons were thought to inhabit Anneliese. These demons were Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, the Roman Emperor Nero, Cain, Adolf Hitler, and a 16th century priest named Fleischmann, who had been excommunicated because of corruption. And because of her upbringing and because of her psychosis, it's most likely that Anneliese created her community and her interpretation of the deepest fears, the most evil people that are in hell. Let's look over these people. Let's look over these demons that were possessing her. First off, we have Lucifer, the morning star, who was cast from heaven because he wanted to overthrow God, the king of hell. And then we have Judas, the name synonymous to betrayal itself, the man who told on Jesus. Then there is Nero, the Roman Caesar, who is known for his persecution of the Christians. And then we have one of the original sins, Cain, who killed his own brother. Then we have Fleischmann, who was a symbol of corruption in the church itself. And then finally we have Hitler, who brought some of the greatest shame ever to Germany. And he was responsible for the death of millions of Jews. And some of you may wonder, what exactly is an exorcism? An exorcism is essentially a formal religious rite that's intended to dispel a demonic spirit from something that it inhabits, which can be a place, a person, or even an object. I'm sure you've heard of haunted places. I'm sure you've heard of the haunted doll. And additionally, not just anybody can perform an exorcism. An exorcism actually requires approval from your local bishop before you can proceed. And not just any priest can perform an exorcism either. The Catholic Church has certain individuals who have been appointed and authorized to perform exorcisms. On August 20th, 1975, after months of advocacy by Father Ernst Alt, Bishop Josef Stengel of Würzburg finally granted the permission to perform the ritual. The church granted permission to Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt to carry out the exorcism. For the church, there was sufficient evidence to show that medical treatment wasn't working. Therefore, it was the only logical conclusion that she was indeed possessed and needed an exorcism. And that's exactly what followed for the next 10 months until her unfortunate death. The formal exorcism sessions began in 1975, and over a 10-month span, around 67 exorcism rites were performed. That's roughly 1 or 2 sessions a week. All of these sessions were recorded. They took place in the family home, and her parents were present for all of them. The audio is rather horrifying. You can hear Anneliese speaking in voices that do not sound like her. They were low and guttural and sounded not human.
Wer ist der Judas und der Nero, der Cain und der Hitler? Fünf Stimme.
Das ist der 6.
Oh, den haben wir gelogen.
Den habt ihr dazu.
She would scream. She would growl. She would say things that priests attributed to the demons inside her. And in return, they would pray. They would command the demons to leave. They would command the demons to identify themselves, because part of the rite is that you cannot expel a demon unless you know them by their name, because the name holds power in the name of God. And ironically, all of this is exactly what you would expect from a neurological standpoint for temporal lobe seizures and psychosis. The voice changes are involuntary vocalizations. The outlandish declarations are a symbolic output of a psychotic mind. And her convulsions and loss of her control over her body, those are seizures. Really, there is no supernatural explanation. But in the extremely devout West Bavaria, in the Michel household, this was the only logical explanation. Possession, not epilepsy. And over time, her health did start to deteriorate. In the beginning, she was able to perform hundreds of genuflections, which is basically when you kneel down to pray. And she would do these so much and so repeatedly that sometimes she would damage her knees and she would no longer be able to stand. But really what deteriorated her health was the fact that she ate less and less. And this was because of the voices in her head. They told her that the food was poisoned and spoiled, contaminated. And she believed them and she just stopped eating. And in addition to starving herself, she would sleep on the floor and she would start biting and injuring herself. Again, her family and the priest did assume this was demonic possession. These were the demons trying to control her body. She would scream so much she would start to lose her voice. And over time her voice would become more and more hoarse. And when you look at pictures from her, it is actually quite horrifying because she has extremely sunken eyes, she's very skeletal looking, and she aged decades in the span of months. To most people, it was obvious that she was dying. However, there was nothing the people around her could do except for keep praying. Now you may wonder, why did they continue these sessions if her situation was getting worse? And that's actually quite simple. Because within the exorcism theology, the escalation of symptoms is actually a sign of success and not a failure. It is believed that the demons are hardest to fight right before they are expelled. The most violent and dramatic manifestations, they come from the final stages of the battle, when the demon is becoming weaker and the closest to being driven out. The priest and her family assumed, as per their religious beliefs, that her physical decline was spiritual progress. And you also have to see this from the parents' point of view. These people are deeply devout Catholic, so much so that if they were to accept that she wasn't possessed, but indeed needed medical treatment, that would mean they would have made a huge mistake over the past several months, and their daughter would have suffered for nothing. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel did eventually die. She was only 23 years old, and she weighed a mere 68 pounds. This is 30.8 kilograms, basically the weight of a 10-year-old. And during the autopsy, it was indeed confirmed that her death was caused by malnutrition, dehydration, and her body just started to eat itself. Sadly, one of the last spoken words to her mother were, "I'm afraid." And the priest assumed this is a statement made by the demons, departing as she begged for absolution. Apologies about the little camera twitch there. My dog decided that apparently the camera stand is very comfortable to lay against. But in reality, it was her asking for help, not the demons. But nobody understood exactly what kind of help she needed. And because her death was so horrifying, the authorities were contacted. They brought to court the audio tapes, the photographs, the diary entries, and everything was examined. Because what they documented was not unambiguous. A woman died due to prolonged religious rituals. even though she was diagnosed with epilepsy and psychiatric illness. In March of 1978, the defendants Father Arnold Rens, Father Ernst Alt, Annaliese's parents Joseph and Michel were all charged with negligent homicide. And when they played the audio tapes, many people in the courtroom were deeply disturbed. Not only because of the sounds that came from Anneliese, but also the fact that a woman was clearly suffering and surrounded by people who genuinely believed they were saving her. I will admit, I do find the audio tapes quite disturbing to listen to. However, the judge did acknowledge that the defendants had acted on a sincere, righteous religious belief, and their intention was not to harm. Quite the opposite, their intention was to save. So they were suspended to 6 months imprisonment and 3 years of probation. And many people argue that this wasn't harsh enough because of what happened to her. The court also clearly stated that she was not possessed, but she was mentally ill. And she was basically failed by the institutions that could have protected her. And I'll be honest, I am personally not sure what I think about this particular sentencing. Because these people did not act out of malice. They didn't know any better. And that doesn't make it any better, but they genuinely believed they were saving her. So I'm not sure if they deserved a harsher sentence or not. And I think this is an interesting moral discussion to have, and I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm usually pretty set on whether I believe people deserve lifetime imprisonment or even death. I especially if you've made the conscious decision to do horrible things, especially upon children and animals. But in this particular situation, they genuinely thought they did the right thing. So I'm not sure if they should have been punished to the full extent of the law. And I guess it becomes an interesting debate because I do take issue with honor killings that take place in certain religions in certain parts of the world. But the difference is when were these people, they thought they were saving her. When you're talking honor killings, you are intentionally taking a life away because of the perceived honor that was besmirched by whoever committed that mistake. It's very different, right? I'm trying to think of how it is comparable. I guess it's almost a bit like, not really, but a bit like when you have Munchausen by proxy. The difference is she needed to spend more time with doctors to get her medication sorted in order for it to work, and then still it would have been tricky because of the condition. So I can't blame the people for assuming that it is possession, because even though we know the facts, it still sounds like, yeah, but is it though? Is it not? It is, however, important to note that her death isn't purely because of religious beliefs. Her death was caused by a myriad of failures: cultural, religious, legal, medical, and communal. The medical system failed her because there was no mechanism to follow up on somebody who had a severe illness to ensure that they were getting adequate treatment and the treatment that they needed. When she declined to go into further treatment, there was nobody that checked in on her to see how she was doing, even though it was known that she needed to be heavily medicated in order to be somewhat functional in society. The church also failed her because they completely disregarded the medical community at this time, and they just cleared her for an exorcism. There was only the permission from the bishop, and that was the only thing that was needed. They knew about her diagnosis. They decided to proceed with an exorcism regardless. German law at that time was also shaped by post-Nazi commitment to personal autonomy. They did not have a real framework to intervene with personal religious practices. And I'm not too sure if the state should intervene with your religious practice. Like what you do in your own home, that should be in the privacy of your own home, as long as you're not harming people, obviously. But if you're doing whatever it is you're doing, then yeah, I don't feel like the state should intervene. Why? But also, if your religious practices involve sacrificing like, I don't know, like cats and sheep and babies, then maybe the state should get involved. Obviously, everything's nuanced and there is, sides to everything. Also, the rural Bavarian community failed her because it was ruled by the church and the stigma that surrounded mental illness. Nobody dared step forward and ask questions. They have, however, changed the law in Germany because of this case. And individuals are now not exempt from criminal liability if somebody dies due to religious negligence. And even within the Catholic Church, the Vatican issued a revised rite of exorcism in 1999, the first major revision in centuries. This revision meant that candidates were required to undergo medical and psychiatric evaluations first before they would be even considered for an exorcism. The church also formally acknowledged that more likely than not, many cases have been positioned wrongfully and interpreted as exorcisms and possessions when actually people were just mentally ill. They acknowledge that it is important for them to distinguish between the two before they can even consider religious intervention. But Annaliese's legacy does live on, as she lays buried in Klingenberg on Main, where even today people bring her fresh flowers to her grave and visit her from all over the world, because some believe that she was indeed possessed and that she was a martyr, that she is a saint of some sort, and some others are simply fascinated by the story. In her way, her grave has become kind of a pilgrimage. Even though the church hasn't formally canonized her, an informal devotion does persist. And her case was also an inspiration to the 2005 movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which has been seen by more than 30 million people.
And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
And she was introduced to an audience of people who had never even heard of her. And I'm sure if you're a lover of true crime, you are probably a lover of horror movies. I am certainly a horror movie lover. And actually, this movie is one of my favorite movies. I personally love horror movies that are around hauntings and possessions, but I don't want to see the ghosts. I don't want to see the spirits. I don't want to see the demons. I want something that works on my psyche. Come for me all you want, but one of the best horror movie franchises, not the last few, but the first 2 or 3 movies of the Paranormal Activity, amazing. Blair Witch Project, that started this idea of the cam footage, incredible. I don't want to see stupid animated ghosts. I want there to be energies, spirits, things happening, because even though I'm not very religious, I did live in a house in Sweden that felt haunted. I've never had such negative feelings, such negative vibes, weird experiences anywhere else I lived, but in this house weird things happened. And I can't explain it, my mother can't explain it, it's just something was off with that place and I have no idea why. So I believe, we'll get into it in a second, we'll get into that part of the question. As recent as 2006, Annaliese's mother actually did an interview and she expressed that she still has no regrets, that she knew she did the right thing because she saw the sign of Christ in her hands. And it's obviously very clear that her mother loved her dearly, and she didn't act from a place of malice. She thought she was doing the best thing for her daughter. And this is kind of the saddest thing about this whole case. She didn't die at the hands of somebody evil, somebody malevolent. No, she died at the hands of people who loved and cared for her more than anybody else in the world. And because of her medical condition, her experiences were real. She smelled evil. She saw the faces of the demons. She heard voices telling her she was going to be damned. She did not do this for attention. She wasn't acting, that's the thing. This was real. This was not a performance. This was her reality. But her reality was altered by a neurological condition. And what she needed was a specialist, a neurologist, and not a priest. She needed lots of time and patience and the right medication regime that had to be adjusted all the time. However, unfortunately, she was instead subjected to 67 exorcisms. It was perceived for her to have demons, to cast out the perceived demons in her body. All the while, her body was slowly dying in front of their eyes. And unfortunately, whilst her body was getting weaker and withering away, this was more sign to the priests and the family that what they were doing was working. Because this is how exorcisms work. You get weaker before you get stronger. She was only 23 years old when she died to the sound of prayer and a voice that's not quite her own. Her last dying words were to her mother, saying, "I'm afraid." So, what are your thoughts on possession and exorcisms? I am personally agnostic, so I don't really know what to believe. I do, however, think that the people who think they are possessed truly think that they are possessed. And I do believe that exorcisms could maybe work for those who think that they are possessed. But do I believe in heaven and hell, demons and angels, God and Satan? Not really, no. But I'm open to have my mind changed if I was to experience something that cannot be explained. I do think there is such a thing as like a creator. But just the biblical sense of heaven and hell, it's not, I know granted hell is a place without God in the Bible, but Dante's version of hell then. It's a bit foreign to me, but then having said that, like I just said, there was a place I lived in Sweden, and weird things definitely did happen there that cannot be explained. I'm pretty sure that place was potentially haunted. So I guess that makes me a hypocrite then. Maybe I don't want to believe. Maybe I've been too sinful. Maybe the thought of good and evil to that degree is somewhat overwhelming and scary. But I'm open to it. I'm open to miracles should they come my way. But maybe you can share some of your experiences. Something that could maybe sway me in either direction. Maybe you've experienced a haunting, a possession. Maybe you've seen things that cannot be explained. Maybe you've witnessed miracles. Maybe you've had your guardian angel reach out to you several times. You have to let me know. I'm genuinely curious to read your comments. And I would also like to hear what you thought about the prison sentence. Do you believe that they should have had a stronger sentence? Do you believe they shouldn't have had one at all? Do you believe this is right? Because of the fact that they were coming from a place of good and not bad? I'm still kind of unsure. And I'm pretty pro extreme punishment, especially when people have done horrible things. I'm sure if you saw my first video, you know that I'm not afraid to speak my mind on what I believe some people deserve. But in this one, I can't really make up my mind. Because again, they didn't do this to be mean. It wasn't an accident either, but they believed they were praying the evil away. But they did kill their daughter in the process. So I don't really have an answer for this particular one. I can see it from both sides. And maybe, do you think maybe she was indeed possessed? Or do you think this was just a temporal lobe epilepsy? Or is temporal lobe epilepsy smoke and mirrors from the devil himself? To make us believe that it was a neurological condition, but in fact, this is just his handy dandy work. To make us believe things that aren't there. That would be quite in his ballpark, wouldn't it? So if you have enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could like it and make sure you are subscribed and turn on your notifications. I'm hopefully back next week with a new episode for you guys. Bye.